Hello, Professor Chen, dear students. I'm Joseph Ting. In previous years, I would talk about the historical background of the founding of the New Asia College. Now this year we have something quite different. We are going to talk about the group of people we call Eurasians. Now the word Eurasians, as you can see, is made up of two words, made up of Europeans and Asians. We are talking about from the middle of the 19th century, Hong Kong became a seaport, a very important seaport. And apart from the local Chinese people, we have foreigners coming from different parts of the world, especially we have the British, we have the Indians, we have the Parsis, we have the Jews, and so on. And these people, when they arrive in Hong Kong, they will usually, either they are single or they will left their family behind. And during their stay in Hong Kong, they will live with a Chinese woman. The descendants of these Chinese, of these foreigner, a Westerner together with a Chinese, we call Eurasians. Now today we are honored to have Andrew Che with us. Andrew coming from one of the most prominent Eurasian families in Hong Kong. And so we are going to hear a lot of interesting stories about some of the very important Eurasians here in Hong Kong. And they actually played a very vital role, especially from the later part of the 19th century to the mid-20th century. So with no further ado, I'll pass the mic to Mr. Andrew Che.
Okay, let's start. Now you can read Chinese. 閒人頭好過跟鬼尾. What does it mean? This is a common saying amongst the Eurasians at the turn of the century. I'm talking about the period 1880 to around 1940. 閒人頭好過跟鬼尾. So what does it mean? It means walking in front of man. Man is Chinese. It's better than following the foreign devils. 鬼佬 is devils, okay? Now you have to understand that 150 years ago, there's racial segregation in Hong Kong. The European don't mix with the Chinese don't mix with the European. And somehow because of the Hong Kong becomes a treaty port, there's a group of Eurasians, half Chinese, half European. So deep down inside their heart, they have to decide, do I want to be a Chinese or do I want to be a foreigner like a European? And after careful consideration, they consider 閒人頭好過跟鬼尾. If I follow the Chinese, I will be leading the Chinese. If I follow the British, I will be a third-class citizen. And they make the right choice. So who are these people? I am a descendant of this group. And what made them so special in the Hong Kong history? And where are they now? We are going to talk about the two questions. Who are these people? And where are they now today? So the story is the Eurasians of old Hong Kong. 香港歐亞混血兒族群. Now you have to understand, rewind the clock 200 years ago, Hong Kong became a British colony in 1841. Hong Kong was a port, it's a trading port between Europe and China. So as a result of British men and foreigners coming to Hong Kong, it evolved a mixed community called the Eurasians. And because of racial segregations, the Eurasians were being discriminated. But somehow, during the period 1880 to around 1930, 1940. These Eurasians turned their disadvantage into advantage because being at the right place at the right time, and they took every opportunity, and they became very successful. They became a middleman between the East and the West, and they helped the government to govern the local populations. So let's look at this photograph. This is actually my family, and we have 10 siblings, and you only see 9 children here. The 10 is not here yet. This is 1950, 54 and 55. Let's take a closer look. Now, what do we look like? We don't look like Chinese, and we don't look like European. We are a mixture of both. Look at my mother. This is myself, my 2 brothers. I'm the youngest one, and my sister. Now, in Hong Kong in the 1950s and the 1960s, at school we were being singled out because we were Bun Tong Fang, so to speak. Our parents in those days, they don't want to talk to us about our heritage. They won't tell you where you came from and where is your ancestry. Our parents wanted us to be Chinese and study Chinese. I went to St. Joseph College, and in those days there were a lot of Portuguese boys. And instead of studying Chinese, they studied French. And also, a lot of Hong Kong boys also study French. But our parents insist that we must study Chinese. Now, Joseph went to the same school. He can tell you.
Well, I still remember in my time, there were lots, in the A class, usually we have the Eurasians and people coming from different parts of the world. There were no international school in those days. So these people have to go to St. Joseph, they go to La Salle, they go to DBS, Diocesan Boys College. So, at that time, I'm quite sure that by now, basically, the school is made up of all Chinese. There are no more Eurasians now.
Okay, my parents were actually Eurasians. Both of them were Eurasians, and both of them were related, and we were part of the whole family. Of course, the whole family is represented by a famous Eurasian, Sir Robert Ho Dong. But we don't know much about our heritage until 1969, when a daughter of Sir Robert Ho Dong wrote the book about the family histories. And also, in 1976, another daughter wrote another book about their mother. So this is how I became aware that we were Eurasians, and I started to learn more about our family. Now, going back to 1980-82, a cousin of my mother called Peter Hall, he was working in Hong Kong, and he actually undertook a very difficult task of connecting all the Eurasians in Hong Kong. In fact, we were all related one way or the other by marriages or by blood. So he wrote a very comprehensive book about the Eurasians in Hong Kong. But back in 1982, he was under a lot of pressure not to publish the book, because a lot of famous Eurasians in those days insisted that they were not Eurasians, they were Chinese. So if you publish this book, Peter, you will embarrass me. So he was forbidden to publish this book until those people were gone, and the book was published in 1992.
Is this book still available?
On the web, it's still available. Okay. But you see a number of personalities here. The famous personality like Stanley Ho, Sir Robert Cook War, M.K. Low, and so on, somehow they are all related one way or the other. So until this book was published, the discussions of Eurasians' heritage was rather more open now. And together in the 2000, from 2000 onwards, we have the DNA test. And from the DNA test, we know more about our heritage. Actually, today we know more about our ancestors than our parents. So let's talk about the background of Eurasians and where do they came from. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Hong Kong was a British colony starting from 1841. The sailors, the merchants came to Hong Kong. These were all men. People from England, from Scotland, from America, from India. The British imports a lot of Indians to come to Hong Kong to do what? To be policemen, to govern the Chinese. The British secret of controlling a colony is to divide and rule. So you need Indians to be policemen to control the local Chinese. And then we have the Parsis merchants and the Jewish merchants.
Do you have any idea who are the Parsis? Have you ever heard of that? They were actually, originally they came from Persia, which is present-day Iran. But, their religion was called Zoroastrian. They are called Zoroastrians. But because the Islam was spread to Persia and they convert everybody into Muslims. But for some of the people, they don't want to be converted. They fled to the western part of India and settled in around Bombay, present day we call Mumbai. This group of people, they still maintain their traditional religion and way of life. And when the British came in the 18th century, some of these people, which we call Parsis, they came with the British to our part of China. Some of these, they actually came to Hong Kong, Macau, and Guangzhou. So in Hong Kong, we have a small population of Parsis. Actually, up to this date, we still have about 200. They have their own temple, they have their own cemetery, actually, and they are a very interesting group of people.
So a little more about the Parsis. The Parsis were Persians who settled in India. And over several hundred years, they mixed with the local and they look like Indian. But these are very smart merchants. So when the British conquered India, when India became a British colony, these people, together with the Jewish people, they mingle with the British and they trade with the British. And why do they come to Hong Kong, come to China? Because of opium. They want to sell opium to China. Now, going back to the 1800s, almost 1/3 of the Hong Kong expat populations were Parsis. And that's why we have a cemetery dedicated to the Parsis in Happy Valley, dated 1852. These are very rich people and they financed the British on the opium trade. And then we also have the Jews. The Jews were also, we had two groups of Jews. The Sephardic Jews from the Middle East, they also settled in India and do business with the Parsi and the British. But we also have the Ashkenazi Jews, the Jews from Eastern Europe, that also came to Hong Kong. So about the Eurasians. Now, put yourself in 1840. The British colonial government maintained a racial segregation policy. The Chinese don't mix with the British. The peak on the Hong Kong island is reserved for the British. The Chinese cannot go even up to the peak. Like the Hong Kong Club, only for the British. And even institutions like the Hong Kong Bank, HSBC. The British have their own toilets. They cannot go to a Chinese toilet or the Portuguese toilets. They maintain segregation between Portuguese, English, and the Chinese. Therefore, to have a marriage between a Chinese girl and a British man is a no-no. It's socially totally unacceptable. As a result, the Chinese still need to have girlfriends, so they kept girlfriends. Instead of marrying her as a wife, he kept her as a mistress. And we call these mistresses protected women. It's a special term for those period, the women having a British boyfriend. A Chinese term, 靠時頭. Now you have to understand, most of the girls in those days can't even read or write. So if they are able to hang on to a British man, the British man will provide the young woman with financial support. So in turn, the woman will provide the sexual relationship. In fact, they have a family and they have children. But they don't keep it as a family, and they are not properly married. So after a few years, the man would leave, and sometimes they would leave money or properties to the woman, and they became very rich. Or sometimes they leave nothing, and the woman will have to get another man to 靠時頭, get another master. So how do they communicate? As I mentioned, they can't read or write. So how can they communicate? They communicate in Pidgin English. Now, what is Pidgin English? You use sound, you use hand signal to communicate. I give you one example. What does it mean? Tomorrow eat meh meh. Meh meh is the sound of a lamb. Tomorrow is tomorrow. It means tomorrow we are having lamb for lunch or dinner. So this is not even Chinglish. This is actually Pidgin English. Another example. This is for the tanker people, the sampan girls. Come shore. Daiban come shore. What does it mean? Come shore means come ashore. Daiban means Taipan, the senior staff of the British company. Come ashore, Taipan, come ashore. So talking about the protected woman, very soon they have a bunch of children. All the children were classified as Eurasians, half English and half Chinese. And they were brought up by the mother. The father would not care at all. So they have Chinese upbringing. As I mentioned, some master would left money, so they were able to go to school and learn to read or write. And Chinese upbringing and Chinese education. And they are studying in Zhongyuan Xuyun, the central school. The central school is a public school established by the Hong Kong government to teach children English. Now, talking about Chinese culture, we are very Chinese. Even today, in my generation, we are Chinese. We don't address people auntie or uncle. Every person will have a proper name, like 家姐,弟弟, 阿哥, 阿姨, 姑姐. Everybody would have a proper title. But addressing people with title gets complicated at times, especially when your parents were cousins. So in my case, the brother of one of my grandfather, I can call him a Sok Gong, or I can call him a Kau Gong, because he was my father's Kau Fu, and also my mother's a Sok. So this gets a little bit complicated at times. But anyway, at heart, the Eurasians were Chinese. But they don't look Chinese. but they have to have a Chinese surnames. All their fathers were 鬼佬, so where do you get your Chinese name? So they make up their own Chinese name. I give you one example. Our family, the Ho family. Where does the word Ho comes from? The grandfather was Bosman. Bosman was a merchant from Holland. Holland is Holland. So Holland, you adopt Ho as the last name. Law is Rothwell. Roth sounds like law, so you have law. This is more interesting. Patterson. Patterson was a senior staff in Jardines as a Taipan.
So we have the Patterson Street.
Exactly. So a Taipan, so it's in Dai. Follow the Taipan. Hong. They use the Chinese word Hong. Hong stands for Hong Mo. British people was called Hong Mo Gui because they have red hair, Hong Mo Gui. So the word Hong comes from the red hair. And then you have the Xin, you have the Chen, and you have the Wang, but I don't know how the words will make up. Look at these people. A very distinguished look. The person on the left is actually my mother, maternal grandfather, Xin Da-Fan. These group of pictures were taken probably in the 1900s, before the Republic of China was born. So they were all wearing, shaved their head and wearing a long queue, pigtail. So the boys shaved their heads. The woman's father was a Jew, and the Chinese mother. Now the second generation became rich, and they have fancy clothes. Well, look at the photograph on the right side. The tall woman, a 鬼婆 in a Chinese dress. Look how funny the shoes is. Her name is actually called Lucy Perry. Her daughter was the headmistress of DGS, Joyce Simon. This is the Simon family. It's unfortunate the two young boys and the boys in the center, they were all killed by the Japanese during the war. I will talk more about that a little bit later. But for showing you this picture is these people don't look Chinese. And sometimes they look like European or half European. So in Hong Kong, we have, so to speak, 5 very famous Eurasian families. Well, in fact, the number of Eurasian families is just a handful, but sometimes you have a bigger family and smaller families. And some families came from Shanghai, but we have 5 families: Ho, Lo, Si, Xin, and Choi. And there is a saying, Ho, Lo, Si, Xin, Choi, 有女唔嫁出外. That means if they have daughters within the family, they marry within the family, they don't marry outside. The reason is because the first generation Eurasians were products of 靠事頭, and eventually they became rich. The second generation were rich Eurasians. But being rich, they want to marry a Chinese girl from a prominent family. But prominent Chinese would not allow the daughter to marry to a Eurasians. On the other hand, they don't want to marry a poor Chinese because they know that a poor Chinese girl would marry for money. And of course, they would never be able to marry a British girl because of racial segregation. So end up, they married within each other. So there's intermarriages within each other. So this slide is show the second generation Eurasians. This is taken probably in the 1920s. It's the best times of the Hong Kong Eurasian because this is the period when they are so rich. Now take a closer look at their fashion, their jewelry, their handbags, and their shoes.
Who are they?
They are all girls from the 5 families. And this woman in the center is actually my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother. Look at the shoes. Western handbags and Chinese dress, Western shoes. So we adopt a culture of Chinese, sometimes we mix with the European culture. This is a photograph of a wedding. This is 1910. 20 years later, it's different. Take a closer look. So talking about intermarriages. The second generation Eurasians have altogether 25 pair of marriages within the family. And even within the whole family, there are 5 pairs of intermarriages within the family. So let's talk about the early days of the Eurasians. Because the government built the central school and the Chinese, the rich Chinese, don't want to send the son to study English. They have Chinese tutors from Beijing to teach them Chinese, bok bok zai. So only the Eurasian went to central school. Only the boys went to central school. The girls did not go to school. And later on, the girls went to DGS. But before DGS was formed, the girls don't go to school. Another photograph I got from the internet about the central school.
So it's later renamed as Wang Yan Shu Yuan, Queen's College.
So after central school, the Low and the whole family were so rich, they were able to send their son to England. This is a group photograph taken in 1906 for farewelling some of the boys who went to England. My mother's father also went to England to study. But many did not graduate. Only a few graduated as lawyer and a doctor. And the rest came back to Hong Kong as playboy because they were so rich.
Who's MK?
MK is Law Man Gam, MK Low. MK Low is the boy sitting in the center with a hat, with a cap. So as I explained about being at the right place at the right time, in the early days of British trade with China, they need somebody who is able to deal with the Chinese because the English cannot speak the language. They do not want to take the credit risk. So they need a middleman to be able to deal with the Chinese and to be a guarantor and take the credit risk. So most of the Eurasians who graduated from the central school were able to command very good English and to write good Chinese. So they took up the position of a comprador. So what is a comprador? Comprador is a Portuguese name, means representative, means agent. But in Chinese, we call it 买办. And being at the right place at the right time, being a 买办 makes a lot of money. And sometimes you make more money than the principal. And what do? They sell foreign products to the Chinese. So in the early days, the British came to Hong Kong with opiums. Later on, they have manufactured products, consumer products from England. And in return, they want to bring back tea, silk, porcelain, and bring it back to England. Because of the uneven trade, you end up with an opium war. But anyway, talking about the whole family, this is a family group photo with the males in 1924. And in the center, in the Chinese dress, the man is called Sir Robert Ho Tong, Ho Dong. To his left side is the half-brother Ho Gam Tong. Ho Gam Tong is actually my father's maternal grandfather. And to Ho Dong's right is Ho Fuk. Ho Fuk's the same brother, biological brother of the same father. Ho Fuk is my mother's grandfather. And behind, the sons. And if you look at this group of photographs, virtually nearly all of the sons took up positions as compradors in the companies that Ho Tong controlled. The only exception is this boy, Shai-lai, who later became a military man, a general. I will talk more about that a little bit later. So with a big family, the second generation came back with the jobs waiting for them, and they make a lot of wealth. And talking about wealth, the wealthiest person in Hong Kong at that time is Ho Tong. When Ho Tong died in 1956, he had a lot of properties in Hong Kong. And the properties accounted for about 2.7% of the government rate's income at that time. So you can imagine how many properties he owned.
Well, have you ever heard of the name 何東？有冇人聽過何東嘅名？ Well, I mean, he was the richest man from 1900 to his death in 1956. So he was after that is Li Ka-shing, of course. So before Li Ka-shing, we have 何東, and before 何東, we have Li Sing. So these are the richest people in Hong Kong.
So he's the largest land owner in Hong Kong and Shanghai, and he was the director of almost every public company in Hong Kong. He controls the comprador office. He appointed nephews to be a comprador, but he actually owns the office of HSBC, Kowloon Wharf, Mercantile Bank. Mercantile Bank was a big bank. It's a note-issuing bank in those days. Jardines and Sassoon. So when you have money, you want to have prestige. And being Eurasians, being looked down by the British and the Chinese earlier, they want to be 發揚光大, so to speak. They want to be 即係要威俾人睇. So 點樣先至叫做威啊? To be prominent in the local circle, you have to be a director of the Donghua Hospital. So this family chart is the first and second generations of the whole family. And look at how many members of those groups were at one time directors of the Donghua Group of Hospital.
In those days, after you became the director of the Donghua Hospital, you'll be awarded an MBE usually, member of the British Empire. Before the Second World War, that's probably the only way when you could climb up the social ladder. In those days, the directors of the Donghua hospitals were nominated by different professions. And He Dong was a comprador, of course.
So let's talk a little bit about He Dong. He Dong's father was called Bosman. He was actually a Jew from Holland. He came to Hong Kong, and what he did was he was in the trade of exporting Chinese labor to San Francisco and New Orleans, 賣豬仔, selling Chinese labor to build railway in 舊金山. But he went bankrupt just a few years later when He Dong was 6 years old, and he left with no money. So the mother, Cici is actually a woman from 崇明島, 浙江省崇明島. She was not a Cantonese. She came to Hong Kong, and then she 靠事頭 with another man and had another children. So, as mentioned, He Dong was the richest man in Hong Kong. He was knighted, honored by the British government. He was also decorated by the Chinese government. 即有個嘉禾章. And he was being advisor to the Chinese government.
Remember, this is the 北洋政府, okay? At that time, we have the 北洋政府, and then Sun Yat-sen has built up another government in Guangzhou. But officially, because the British government only recognized the 北洋政府as the official government of China in those days.
Now, as I mentioned, when you have wealth, you want prestige, and you want power. Now, He Dong was a very aggressive man. He wanted to get involved with the politics of China. But being a very rich man, he knew that without any military backup, he would have no say in China. So he decided to send one of his sons to be a military man. And I will talk more about that a little bit later. Now, this is a letter from Lai Yunhong, the president of the Republic of China in those days, appointing He Dong as a consultant. So he was very much involved with the Chinese politics. Actually, in the early 1920s, China was going a period of warlords, infightings. And He Dong wanted to invite all the warlords to Hong Kong to have a roundtable meeting for the purpose of uniting China. But he was never successful. And sometimes he went to China to broker a deal to have mining rights for the British companies. So he is actually a political broker. So with wealth, you have prestige and you have authorities. Talking about authorities, this is the 1908 publication, The 20th Century Impression of Hong Kong. And it says the prominent members of the Chinese community. And you have about 30 businessmen here.
There's something very special about this photo because you can see that the richest man in this picture got the smallest picture. Can you see He Dong? Where's He Dong?
He Dong is the second line
The smallest one.
The smallest one in the middle.
I'm quite surprised. I mean, always surprised when I see this photo, because it's very, very strange that the richest man got the smallest photo. I think the reason being that he refused to pay. I think that's the only reason for that.
Maybe he refused to pay for the subscriptions.
Exactly.
But anyway, look at the group of 30 people. About 1/3 were Eurasians. We have 7 Eurasian men here, and 5 belongs to the whole family. He Kim Tong, He Dong, He Fuk were brothers. Luo Chang Xiu and Wang Kim Fuk were brothers-in-law. So you can imagine the Eurasians control a fraction of the economy of Hong Kong in those days. So if you want to know more about Ho Tong, I'm not going to talk about here, but there are 2 very good books. A Chinese book written by Jian Wentai and Wang Xiuleng, very detailed descriptions of He Dong, and an English book, very easy to read like a fiction, Sir Robert Ho Tong by May Holsworth. And you can get these in bookstores.
Strongly recommended, especially the Chinese one.
So let's talk about some very successful Eurasians in recent days. In the first half of the 20th century, we went through from Ting dynasty to the revolution in 1911, followed by civil war in China, the warlords period, and then 1949, People's Republics of China, followed by the Cultural Revolutions, and the 67 riots. So we've gone through a lot of uncertain period, and during those periods, a lot of Eurasians could not see the future in Hong Kong, and they migrated. And they became very conservative. And most of the Eurasians of my mother's generation, the 3rd generation, who decided to remain in Hong Kong, became very conservative. They entered the government as civil servants, they became teachers. And there were only a few examples. A few examples of people willing to take risk. So I'm going to highlight a few Eurasians who took risk and became very successful. The first one is George Ho, He Zhuoji. He was actually the founder of 商業電台, commercial radio. He was in the broadcast business and became quite successful. Of course, you have Stanley Ho, and most of you, I'm sure you know Stanley Ho, a very rich man who only died in recent years. He is in the gaming business in Macau. And He Hongzheng, most of you don't know him. He only died in recent years. He is the grandson of Sir Robert Ho Tong. He was very rich because he inherited all the properties from the grandfather. But he was very interested in being a political broker. Well, look at the photograph that he was meeting every generation of Chinese leader in Beijing. And unofficially, he was a political broker between China and America, and sometimes North Korea. So he quite enjoyed, he's a very funny man, and quite enjoy political brokering. And I'm sure everybody would know this man. Who is he? Li Xiaolong. Li Xiaolong is actually a grandson of He Kim Tong. He Kim Tong had a mistress in Shanghai, and Li Xiaolong's mother was the daughter of He Kim Tong. And then another man, this is Shai-lai. As I mentioned, the son of Sir Robert Ho Tong. He went to study in the military school in England, came back to Hong Kong, went to China, and worked for a warlord called Zheng Zhou Lam in Manchuria. And when Zheng Zhao-lam was murdered by the Japanese, he worked for his son Zheng Ho-leung and eventually became a Kuomintang general. You see here, he was in a military uniform. And before he died, he went to Taiwan and met his old boss, Zheng Ho-leung. Okay, so much so for the living Eurasians. So what happened when they die? I'm talking about the Eurasian cemetery. We have all sorts of different ethnic group cemeteries in Hong Kong. We have the Hong Kong cemeteries, the Parsis in 1952, as I mentioned. 1/3 of the foreign populations in Hong Kong were Parsis. But we did not have a Eurasian cemetery until 1897. Now, before 1897, the dead Eurasians were buried in a place called Ga Fei Yun, Coffee Garden, in Caroline Hill. It's just right behind the Hong Kong Stadium in Causeway Bay. But in those days, the government decided to clear up the grave sites and move them elsewhere, and Ho Tong was asked by the elders of the women to look for a piece of land dedicated for the Eurasians. So Ho Tong took up the duty and negotiated with the Hong Kong government to get a piece of land in Mount Davis on Hong Kong Island. So the lease was granted in 1897 for Eurasian cemetery. The inland lot 1415. You see the cornerstone here, IL 1415, at the entrance of the cemetery. And at the entrance is a very funny plaque. Take a look. It mentioned that this place is granted by the government in the year 1897 and only for Eurasians, and other people are not allowed to enter here. So you have to do it in those days because other people would just bury the dead here. It's uncontrollable in those days. So let's take an aerial view of the Chiu Yun Cemetery. This is actually in the western part of Hong Kong Island, facing north. We'll take a closer look. All the graves, most of the graves were Chinese style.
What we call the horse 馬蹄形。
Now, towards the bottom, this is very funny. This is actually a private lot within the Chiu Yun Cemetery, and for the Ho Kim Tong family.
Have you ever heard of Ho Kim Tong? Have you ever been to the Sun Yat-sen Museum, 孫中山紀念館? It's actually converted from Kim Tong Dai, which was built by Ho Kim Tong in 1914, I think.
Well, in 1915, he built a private corner for himself, a small house and 3 terraces. He actually built the tomb for himself before he died. He was only 40 years old. This was built in 1915. He died in 1950. Now, in those days, Ho Kim Tong was very interested in feng shui. And there is a saying that if you get a very good feng shui day and build your tomb, you will be able to capture the good fortune for your future generations. But if you build it before you die, you will be able to cash in for the future fortune. That's why he built his tomb in 1915. And he was quite a playboy. He had 12 concubines. So the first level, he built a tomb for himself and his wife, followed by the tombs for his concubine, and the third level for his male descendants. So apart from Ho Kam Tong, I show you some quite interesting graves in Chiu Yun Cemetery. This is actually the grave of Ho Fuk, the brother of Ho Dong.
The grandfather of Ho Hong San.
It's my mother's grandfather. He died in 1925. That was the period when 1925 was the period the Eurasians were most rich. So this is the most expensive graves in the Chiu Yun Cemetery. All the stones were imported from Santao. And you have two epitaphs, Mo Ji Ming, from very famous people. One from Lai Yunhong, the president at one time of the Republic of China, and Dun Kei-sui, prime minister of those periods. This is the tomb of Ho Tong's mother. Of course, it has to be big, but let's take a closer look.
Okay, when you look at this tombstone, what would you observe? Anything special? Do you find there's something very unusual about this tombstone? Because apart from the name of Ho Tong's mother, the name of his father is also inscribed here. But remember, he has already left. He's a Jew coming from Holland. So in order that Ho Tong's mother could enjoy the sort of the honor of being 二品夫人. So actually he bought this 二品夫人 because in those days it's quite common to buy the titles, what we call the titles. So the 二品 is the highest level. You cannot buy 一品, so 二品 is the highest. So in order that his mother could enjoy this honor, he buy a title for his father, which is actually not existing. So this is very unusual. And also, the name of the father is also inscribed on the tombstone, although he has already left. It has nothing to do with this tombstone. So this is something very unusual. And you'll see this later in other tombstones as well.
So as mentioned earlier, deep in the heart, the Eurasians were Chinese. So when they die, they want to be Chinese. So being Ho Dong, a prominent man, if I have my mother's grave at Chiu Yun Cemetery, I must have my father's grave too. Otherwise, where's my father? People would ask, where is my father? So he would create an imaginary grave, a cenotaph. Yi Kun Chong, Chinese called Yi Kun Chong. Bosman actually left and settled in London. He died in 1892, and this is his grave in the Brompton Cemetery in London. But you have an artificial grave in Hong Kong. And also in Chiu Yun, we also have other cenotaphs. This is because we want to be recognized as Chinese. Shan Gong Xian Seng Fun. Seng Fun sounds like Stephen. My mother's maternal grandfather is called Xin Dat Feng. And he wanted to have a grave for his father. His father actually left for England. His father's name was Stephen. 成歡 sounds like Stephen. So you have a 相公成歡 right besides the mother's grave. Another one is quite interesting. The Low family. The European is a Mr. Rothwell, a tea merchant from Shanghai. He actually died in Hankow. We call Wuhan, Wuhan today, but in those days we call Hankow, Hanhou. But the sons in Hong Kong had a cenotaph for him. 羅公富華, 羅富華 sounds like Rothwell, Rothwell, 羅富華. He was actually buried in Hankow, but he has a grave in Hong Kong. And what is funny is several years ago, this is one of the descendants from the Rothwell family in Europe. They were doing DNA tests and find that there's a linkage in Hong Kong and came to Hong Kong to do family research. But not only we want to be Chinese, we want to adopt the Chinese culture. So Ho Tong's father and father-in-law, they have their own 神主牌, ancestral tablet in Dongling, 國院. 密公祈廉 is McLean. 何公士民 is Bosman. So the conclusion is, Eurasians want to be Chinese when they die, and they want to be recognized as Chinese. So now I'm going to talk something about 香港人. What is 香港人? In my younger days, in the 1950s and the 1960s, the Eurasians would call ourselves 香港人. The reason why we call ourselves 香港人, because in those days, people would not say 我係中國人. They would not use the term 中國人. They would rather say 我係廣東人, 我係上海人, or whatever. So when people ask the Eurasians, 你係咩人? And people would say, 我係香港人. So when my classmate asked me, being looking so funny, 喂 Andrew, 你係咩人? 我話我係香港人. And they would laugh at me. 你係咩人啊? 香港冇人㗎，你鄉下喺邊度? Well, how can I say we have no 鄉下, so to speak? Most of the Eurasians don't have a 鄉下, because the father sides were from Europe, not from China. So only in those days that Eurasians would call themselves 香港人. And they really consider Hong Kong as their home. Because they are so attached to Hong Kong that during the Japanese War, they signed up as volunteers. They joined the army to defend Hong Kong. But unfortunately, Hong Kong in those days was undefendable when the Japanese came. You should surrender. Like Singapore, the Singaporeans surrender, there's no killing. But the British government insisted the military in Hong Kong, you have to fight until the last man. So many of the Eurasians were virtually murdered by the Japanese. Well, look at all the graves in the Stanley Military Cemetery. And these are all my relatives, young men in the 1940s murdered by the Japanese because they wanted to defend Hong Kong. But the most unfortunate part is, after the war, after the Eurasians gave up their life for Hong Kong, there is no formal acknowledgement after the war by the Hong Kong government. The Eurasian has no place in the history. The place in the community is not clearly recognized. There's no open acknowledgement to welcome Eurasian at that time. I'm talking about 1950s. So there was one Eurasian boy called Shai-lai. He was studying in England, but he was very fluent in Chinese. He wrote a poem, a Chinese poem. 蝙蝠如鼠又如禽 The bat is like a rat and a bird. 日棲古廟夜入林 During the day, they live in Asian temple, and by night it entered the forest. 有誰知道蝙蝠苦 Who knows the bitterness of the bat? 獸身藏着鳥兒心 Within the bat body is the heart of a bird. So this is the feeling of most Eurasians in those days after the war. It's an identity crisis. So who are these people? I have talked about the Eurasians. The Eurasians are these peoples. And what made them so special in the Hong Kong histories. The Eurasians were able to capture the right moment in time, being at the right place at the right time. They were being discriminated by both the Chinese and the British, but they worked very hard, they were very smart. They learned English. And being able to command English and Chinese, they were able to help the government to govern the Chinese. They were the Chinese leader, so to speak, like Ho Fuk was a Chinese leader in the Legislative Council. And Ho Tong was a comprador. The compradors were able to do business between the East and the West. So being at the right place at the right time and being hardworking and being smart, they climbed to the top of the social ladder. They considered Hong Kong home. They defended and died for Hong Kong during the Japanese invasion. So where are they now? So after the war, there's no more advantage being a Eurasian because everybody knows English. The comprador positions in big companies were abolished. So many Eurasians became civil servants or medical doctor, and very few entered business except the few I just mentioned. The government appointed Chinese to be Chinese leader instead of Eurasians. But more importantly, after the Second World War, there's no more racial segregation. Interracial marriage is recognized, it's legal, socially acceptable. So there is no more need for Eurasian to intermarry among themselves. So they would marry Chinese or Guilou, and they merge into the local society. After the 1967 and the uncertainty of the 1997 return Hong Kong to China, a lot of local Eurasians have migrated to other parts of the world. So today, the Eurasians who remain in Hong Kong have emerged into the local society. And the old Hong Kong Eurasians is a history. There's no more. So that's all I want to say. Joseph, you want to say a few words?
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting and informative and inspiring talk.
For those boys or girls who want to know more
yes.
about the Eurasian family.
Yes.
Several years ago, a relative wrote a book about the 5 Eurasians family in Hong Kong, 何羅斯閃菜, a very comprehensive book about the Eurasian family. And you can buy this book by scanning the QR code. And if you want to have the notes of this presentation, You can scan the presentation notes. Okay, question and answers.
Yeah. Q&A time. Any question? Any question from the floor? I think we still have about 15 minutes. Any question? You may raise question in either English or China or Cantonese or 普通话, whatever you like.有冇問題? This is a rare chance, so don't hesitate to raise your question. We've got the right man here today.
For those who are interested in 何金堂, you can visit the Sun Yat-sen Museum in Castle Road. I mean, he is quite a Renaissance man. Yeah. But this is not the topic for 何金堂 today.
The place is under renovation and will be reopened next year to mark the 100th anniversary of the death of Sun Yat-sen. He passed away in 1925. So next year will be just 100 years. Any question? 大家有冇咩問題？隨時發問，乜嘢問乜嘢都得嘅。OK？ Well, just now, Andrew talked about the Eurasian cemetery, but I discovered that some of the Eurasians were actually buried in the permanent Chinese cemetery in Aberdeen, in 香港仔。香港仔華人永遠墳場。I get it that 陳啟明
Tyson. He was buried at the Aberdeen Chinese Permanent Cemetery. But talking about Ho Tong being the most prominent Eurasians, he actually founded the Eurasian Cemetery. But he wasn't buried there. He was buried at the Colonial Cemetery in Happy Valley. And I'll tell you the reason why. Ho Tong was the man that liked challenge. Like in the early days, the peak was reserved for the European. And Ho Tong was the first non-European to live on the peak. So when he died, he wanted to be buried in the colonial cemetery, the cemetery that was reserved for the British. So he wanted to be exceptional.
Any question? 真係冇啊I mean 大家聽完應該有好多疑問㗎，即係好難得機會大家問。呢個嗰本書正話介紹嗰本書咧係好精彩啊 Eric Ho。Eric Ho 咧係叫何鴻鑾啊。何鴻鑾 was actually the grandson of 何福啊 and I think he became the what？ 咩職位我唔記得啦。
Secretary for Commerce, I think there's a question.
Oh, okay, one question. Okay, thank you.
你好，兩位教授你好啦。咁我想問下，就係何東嘅仔何世禮啊，咁同張學良有啲關係。咁我想問多啲關於呢啲佢哋兩個故事。
Maybe Joseph 你答你熟啲啊，張學良同何世禮同埋中國嗰個關係
其實咧，即係嗰陣時咧，就係即係軍閥割據啦。咁我哋有所謂直系有奉系，咁奉系嘅領袖咧就係張作霖啊。張作霖佢嗰個佢主要咧就係管我哋嘅東北。咁啊就係喺瀋陽呢個地方啦嚇。咁啊但係咧就佢就俾即係喺俾日本人咧係暗殺咗。暗殺咗之後咧，張學良咧就替咗佢個位。嗱，其實咧就我哋知道咧，其實大家會覺得好奇怪嘅，一個咁有錢嘅人點會俾個仔去當兵嘅咧？咁呢樣嘢幾奇怪。但係如果大家睇翻嗰個年代嘅中國咧，最有力量嘅係咩咧？係軍閥，當兵嘅先係最有，即係唔係做文人，係當兵先至係最，即係喺當時嚟講係最有地位、最有實力嘅。 咁所以何東咧佢就即係俾，而且呢個仔咧自細就好有興趣即係當兵嘅，所以咧就俾佢去即係軍校讀書，去咗英國讀軍校，去咗法國嘅軍校。咁所以咧就咁，我諗佢亦都好聰明。喺嗰個年代咧，就蔣介石仲未北伐成功嘅，所以佢咧就揀咗張學良，即係揀咗張作霖啊，即係俾佢個仔咧。咁而且應該何東同張作霖係有生意關係嘅，咁所以佢揀咗張作霖，就俾個仔跟張作霖。咁估唔到咧，張作霖咁快咧就即係俾人殺咗，咁所以變咗咧就跟呢個張學良。咁啊當然啦，我哋知道張學良收尾咧就係即係好快就投降咗，即係呢個北伐軍啦。咁所以咧就佢亦都係即係成為呢個國民黨嘅其中一個軍官啦嚇。咁所以即係着呢個何世禮咧，後尾亦都變咗，當然變咗呢個國民政府嘅一個即係好重要嘅將軍。咁其實佢係即係大家留意啦，可以留意到佢其實有好多即係功績嘅，做過好多嘢嘅嚇。咁即係何東呢個仔係即係一個好出名嘅將軍。咁另外咧就佢除咗係將軍之外咧，就其實何東喺香港有份報紙嘅，叫《工商日報》。咁呢個報紙咧其實喺香港回歸97年之前咧就停咗㗎啦，冇咗㗎啦啊！咁但係呢份報紙咧就係何家嘅，咁而且亦都係何東咧係交咗俾何世禮打理嘅。咁所以主要嚟講就係咁樣樣啦。咁所以即係佢哋當兵嗰啲咧，就對於佢哋嘅領袖咧係好忠心嘅。咁我哋知道咧，張學良因為西安事變之後咧，佢就俾蔣介石，即係蔣介石去撤退台灣咧，就連張學良都帶埋去。所以張學良咧其實喺台灣咧係監禁咗好幾十年，直至到年紀好大，蔣介石都過咗身，佢先至放翻出嚟。咁然之後，張學良即係何世禮咧，就趁住呢個機會咧，亦都去探過呢個即係老上司啊！咁我哋睇嗰幅相咧，其實係好有感情嘅，即係佢對個老上司張學良咧，仍然係忠心耿耿嘅嚇，即係大致上係咁樣樣。OK。
唔該晒，唔該晒。
Any more question？
唔該，我想問下點解靠事頭會譯咗做呢個 protected woman 嘅？因為 protected 應該係一個保護嘅意思，但係靠事頭呢個佢會有少少負面啦，即係一種肉體同埋金錢上面嘅交易。我想問下，如果佢咁樣譯做咗呢個 protected woman， 其實係咪唔太準確，或者背後係咪有啲咩意思？
其實靠事頭同 protected women 嘅意思係兩樣嘢嚟嘅。protected women 咧就係其實咧嗰啲人咧會有個事頭嘅，咁呢個事頭其實係西人嚟嘅，即係其實呢個西人咧就養起佢嘅，即係包起佢。我哋要用呢個包字啦，包起佢嘅，即係話其實嗰啲西人嚟到香港咧，咁佢就揾一個中國嘅婦女，咁其實有唔少係疍家人嚟嘅，即係唔少係水藏人嚟嘅，咁就然之後佢喺呢度生活嘅時候咧，同佢一齊生活嚇。咁其實靠事頭咧，我諗係佢自己講嘅，即係嗰個女人自己本身，即係嗰啲女人通常都冇乜點教育嘅，冇讀過書嘅，咁佢哋就話你做咩？我靠事頭啦咁。咁 protected women 咧就係另外一樣嘢嚟嘅，就係英文佢覺得呢啲人咧係受到即係一個西人去保護佢嘅，即係所以就叫做 protected women。咁呢個咧其實係 Carl Smith 阿斯奇洛牧師，即係佢係一個好出名嘅香港史學者啦。咁佢喺研究喺佢嘅文章裏邊係研究過，專門係研究 protected women。咁所以如果大家有興趣咧，就可以睇啊 Carl Smith。佢嗰個年代佢喺崇基嘅嚇，即係好耐以前喺崇基，佢過咗身。咁佢咧就即係有好多嘅文章係提到 protected women 呢樣嘢嘅，大家有興趣可以去睇。
Hello， 咁樣咧，我就想問翻你啱先可能提到，因為你特殊嘅身份咧，可能喺以前你會俾異樣嘅眼光看待啦，就可能華人或者非華人嘅身份都好，即係呢兩個族群都好，都有可能以異樣嘅眼光看待過你。咁我想問你對呢啲可能種族歧視嘅看法又點樣睇咧？又點樣諗咧？甚至可能 我唔知道你而家嘅情況係點樣啦。我想問，可能而家嘅華人對你嘅睇法係點樣？仲有冇可能以前嘅嗰種都係嗰種唔係太好嘅目光嚟看待你？
即係當然你係即係 you don't look Chinese， 所以點都係啲人會即係覺得你係即係用啲唔好聽嘅名詞去 describe 你啦。咁但係即係我哋嘅教育咧，就即係我個 parents 咧，就要你有好多 self confidence。咁要點講咧？就係即係 Eurasians 咧，就即係你會靚仔啲，你靚仔過人哋啊，即係着數啲，同埋醒目啲，計數叻啲。咁講翻即係呢個係細佬哥啊。咁講翻現代咧，都有啲咁嘅經驗。即係 for example， 我揸個回鄉證去國內啦，即係過關咧，有時個官員咧會問下你叫咩名㗎，即係咁我同個普通話同佢講兩句咧，佢會覺得你好叻。咁同埋即係 being Eurasians 咧，我有一個 advantage 咧，就係即係我啲普通話咧，即係我啲普通話說得不好，即係喺國內咧。你講得唔好，人哋會覺得你好好，因為你一個鬼佬識講普通話咧，佢就已經係好欣賞你，即係佢唔會當你係 Eurasian， 佢就當你係鬼佬。所以即係歧視呢樣嘢咧，我覺得喺今日呢個時代已經係冇咗噶啦，即係冇歧視呢樣嘢。
好，唔該晒。
大家唔好忘記一樣嘢，何東佢個 father 係一個嚟自荷蘭嘅猶太人，而佢個阿媽咧係一個華人。咁大家諗下，世界上做生意最叻係咩人啊？就係猶太人 and Chinese。所以你知道呢個人其實係猶太加埋 Chinese 係天下無敵嘅，真係我咁樣睇呢樣嘢。即係呢兩個類人加埋一齊，其實做即係嗰個人其實兼具猶太人血同埋華人嘅血統咧。佢做生意真係無往不利嘅，即係我哋睇何東嗰個成功咧，係即係從血統上我哋可以睇到佢嗰種好獨特嘅地方啊！好 ，any more question？ 仲有冇問題？好難得機會啊！大家唔好錯過呢個機會。我哋 Andrew， 大家知道 Andrew 個名叫做謝天賜嚇，天賜個名非常好嘅嚇。
Hello， 我想問個問題就係咧，其實呢班歐亞人喺嗰陣嗰個年代咧，其實佢哋係咪一個生活喺夾縫入邊嘅人咯？即係佢哋好似即係又唔算話得到好多，即係華人又會覺得佢哋係歐洲人啊，但係歐洲人又會覺得，就譬如話，即係可能就有睇過就係話佢哋英國嗰啲人通常都會喺太平山嗰啲位置度起屋嘅，但係其實歐亞人都未必可以喺嗰個地方去起屋啦。所以我覺得佢哋好似可能佢哋為咗可能有錢，就係為咗揾嗰個佢哋嘅身份認同咯。同埋我覺得頭先有講到就係話，即係歐亞人佢哋話佢哋冇貫籍㗎嘛，即係佢哋會話自己係香港人。其實我都有少少感受，就係因為我都係一個原居民啦。咁其實我睇翻我嘅族譜嘅時候咧，我發覺其實我都係冇貫籍啊，即係我屋企人都係同我講話喺我小學嗰啲手冊度貫籍就係求其填翻個，尤其填個保安就算數啊。所以其實我都覺得就係我都會話自己係香港人咯，所以就多謝。
其實咧，佢哋呢啲 Eurasian 有啲真係填保安㗎，知唔知啊？
佢係填保安嘅。
佢填保安㗎，佢個籍貫係保安啊。即係
你睇何鴻燊葬嗰陣咧，佢個棺材係中國式嘅棺材，係寫住保安。
點解會保安咧？其實呢個好有趣，因為香港英國人未攞走之前，呢個地方係屬於保安。保安之前叫做咩？叫做新安縣。新安縣係咩咧？新安縣就係深圳加埋今日成個香港，就有個名叫做新安縣。去到民國嘅時候咧，佢就發現新安呢個名咧就撞咗安徽一個好出名嘅地方叫做新安，所以佢就唔要新安啦，佢就叫做保安。咁所以好多 Eurasian 咧，佢因為喺香港出世，佢呢個地方以前屬於保安。所以佢嘅籍貫就係保安啦。其實我哋香港嘅新界所有嘅人嘅籍貫基本都係保安嘅，因為佢哋原居民嘅籍貫就係保安嚇，即係呢個係我諗大家要明白呢樣嘢嘅。
多謝。
仲有冇問題？我諗差唔多最後一條問題啦啊！最後一條，快啲，唔該，唔好客氣。如果冇咧，我諗今日時間差唔多。I think time's up. So we're going to close this talk. So we'll invite.
Okay, so thank you very much. And